SRI launched one of the world's first AI labs nearly 60 years ago, and we've made groundbreaking advances in the field ever since. Shaky, the first mobile robot with the ability to perceive its surroundings, reason, and act in response to humans. The technology that led to Siri. Innovations in computer vision that helped enable autonomous driving. Augmented reality trainings. AI that improves healthcare, that addresses critical issues in energy and sustainability, that improves design and manufacturing, and that protects against evolving threats to our national and personal security. And by embedding AI within learning environments, SRI is helping define the very future of education and work. Today, our work in AI spans multiple labs and locations, but our human-centered approach remains the same as ever. Working across disciplines and in close collaboration with our government and commercial customers to create new technologies while strengthening the guardrails so we can all truly benefit from AI's extraordinary promise.
Hello, welcome and good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out to the PARC Forum tonight. I'm Jim Fritz, Senior Vice President here at SRI. Very glad you could all come today. We have a great panel on AI and the future of trust, and I'm sure you're going to be very excited about it. I know I am. I'd also like to thank Schmidt Sciences, who is our sponsor for the evening. We're very excited that they've come along and help us put together this event for you all, and I'm sure it will be great. We'll hear a little bit more from Schmidt in just a couple minutes. I would like to thank the panel, and we'll introduce them shortly. Tonight, we also are very lucky to have a great moderator, Rachel Myrow, who's a senior reporter for KQED's Silicon Valley desk. Just to give you a little bit of background on Rachel, and she'll come up and moderate here shortly. But Rachel brings a thoughtful and critical approach to Silicon Valley narratives and reports on all things that matter to California, the tech community, and therefore the national stage. From KQED's Silicon Valley news desk. She is a regular on KQED's Forum and Commonwealth Club and contributes to NPR's Here and Now. She is an award-winning journalist, and she's lived in the Bay Area for decades and earned her master's degree in journalism from UC Berkeley. And as I mentioned, she'll be coming out shortly, and we'll introduce the panel. I just have a couple of housekeeping items to go over before we get going. First of all, during the event, we'll have somebody coming around handing out these index cards. If you have questions you would like to ask the panel, you can write them on the cards. We'll collect them. They'll be turned over to the moderator, and at the end of the event, Rachel can use those to foster some more discussion with the panelists. Emergency exits. If something happens, we need to egress. The two doors that you came through in the back are the way out. At the end of the event tonight, there will be a reception up in the cafeteria or the cafe area, just up the stairs and across. You can follow the signage to get up there. But please do take any of your items, your backpacks, your books, notebooks, whatever you have with you. This facility will be locked after we leave, and you won't be able to get back in and get that. And now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. David PARC. David is the CEO of SRI, and we'll talk a little bit about SRI and what we're doing and how things are going here. David, over to you.
Thank you, Jim. I want to add my welcome, and I won't take much time because I want to move to the panel so you can enjoy this really important discussion about AI and the future of trust. But I did want to say you're in a very special place. You're sitting here at PARC, which became part of SRI in 2023, just a few years ago. And also, SRI today is an independent nonprofit research institute. We'll be celebrating our 80th birthday next year, so you can be on the lookout for special events next year. And over all that time, SRI has had one very simple mission, and that is to create and deliver world-changing solutions that make the world safer, healthier, and more sustainable. Sounds like motherhood and apple pie, but that's actually what excites the team to get up every morning and come to work and have that kind of impact. It's also one where we, in the 80s, incorporated Sarnoff labs from RCA. And so if you think about SRI, formerly Stanford Research Institute, spun out in the 70s as independent, Sarnoff coming in the 80s, and PARC in 2023, you have the places that brought to the world really the future of work and office and education, laser printing, Ethernet, ARPANET, Shaky, the world's first mobile robot that you saw there, color television, global satellites in terms of weather satellites, liquid crystal display, and more recently, a whole host of things related to quantum, space, and also things in terms of treatments and very new and novel precision medicine, biomedical devices and technologies. We're about 1,100 people across the US, half here in the Bay Area, other major campuses, Princeton, Ann Arbor, DC. And we also, interestingly, you'll find, have a history of over 60 years in Japan, partnering with the country and companies there. In fact, we're helping them develop their own innovation ecosystem. And as you think about AI, our role is not to do the foundation models. We're missing a few $1 billion to be able to do that. But we do think about what comes beyond and next. How is a world in an age of AI going to be? How do we re-envision education? How do we think about safety? How do we think about the things that enable people to work in that space? And so these are the things we're doing and working together. And I think we're going to have an excellent panel tonight. Before we get to the panel, I'd like to introduce important guests, Mark Greaves. Mark is with Schmidt Sciences. He's seen AI through the lens of defense, private sector, and the public good. Mark is the vice president of Schmidt Sciences. And among other duties, he oversees Schmidt Sciences' grant-making portfolio for AI and advanced computing. And as he said, when you're in that role, you never tell a bad joke nor have a bad meal because everyone knows your role there, right? He received his PhD next door at Stanford and was formerly with the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, running large government AI programs for national security. So one, I want to welcome Mark. I want to thank Mark and Schmidt Sciences for their sponsorship of this event so we can have this important conversation, and personally thank Eric because I know he's one who's very much supportive of this and the mission of SRI, PARC, and the rest. So Mark, please.
Science doesn't move forward on its own. It takes questions no one's dared to ask, people bold enough to ask them, and the freedom to follow curiosity. Founded by Eric and Wendy Schmidt, Schmidt Sciences embodies the curiosity, rigor, and drive that define science. We know what it takes to unlock new discoveries. That's why we support bold ideas and foster the space to explore research across fields that shape our future. AI and advanced computing, astronomy and space, biosciences, climate, and the systems that hold science itself together. We help build and sustain the infrastructure for science and scientists to thrive, to collaborate with leading researchers and nonprofits, and improve how science is conducted, making space for serendipity along the way. Our goal isn't just to fund science, it's to amplify it, to make it more open and impactful, improving lives, widening horizons, and ensuring discoveries are available to everyone, everywhere. Because when we power science, we power possibility. We are Schmidt Sciences.
This is actually only the second time I've seen it. We are a new philanthropy. We are about 18 months old. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit about Schmidt Sciences before we start. But but first, kind of on a personal note, it is an honor to be sponsoring this PARC forum. I first visited PARC in the late 80s. And this place has always been special. And the quality of people it attracts, the quality of dialogue and conversation it stimulates I think is a national treasure. And so it is a privilege to be sponsoring this forum. Next chart. First thing we got to do, of course, is tip the hat to our founders, Eric and Wendy Schmidt. They have a vision for science. They have put together a group of people who can execute that vision, and they keep on pushing us to do better. Next chart. But we are not the only entity in Eric and Wendy's purview. There's quite a few of them. We have an Ocean Institute that has a research boat that drives around. We have the Schmidt on the other side, the Schmidt Institute for Long COVID that looks at that. We have foundations. We have a lot of things. But Schmidt Sciences is in particularly devoted to science philanthropy. So next chart. And the key word is to accelerate, right? We, especially in this age of collapsing United States federal funding for science, one of the things that we can do is to try and keep science productivity up by making it faster. And so really accelerating the production of knowledge with tools, with infrastructure, is something that we do. Next chart. We have 5 areas of grant making. The AI and advanced computing area, which is one I oversee. Astrophysics and space, biosciences, climate, and science systems. We're actually one of the largest funders of postdocs around the world in the hard sciences. Next chart. So again, you see this word accelerate. High risk and underfunded work. I've been a program officer a lot of my career. I know that, for example, in the National Science Foundation, to get a grant there, oftentimes you have to have done 90% of the work, and you have to pass a review board, you know, where their job is to reduce your risk. So this is actually one of the things I always wanted to do, was fund higher risk work and take on sort of a lot more people who I thought were excellent. So we do that. We hold interdisciplinarity close because we think it's a leverage point. And again, we try and accelerate stuff. And so final chart. I know you can't read this, but there's Schmidt Sciences in the middle. There's our 5 areas in the outside. And then different programs, which sort of spin off of each side and or each program area. It's exciting. It's an exciting time to be in science philanthropy and trying to keep up science productivity, trying to do new things, you know, find new approaches, and think new thoughts. And kind of in conclusion, of course, that's what we're trying to do here. By sponsoring this forum, by having people like Tino and Mitchell here, and to try and really push forward thinking in areas that are relevant to science and our society. So thank you very much for coming.
All right, checking that this thing is on. Yeah? Okay. Thank you all so much for having us here tonight in this storied location. I'm so excited to have this conversation with these 2 brilliant people on stage and also with the rest of you. Just to give you a sense of what's coming next, if you haven't already heard it, because we were back there, so I'm not quite sure what was said. I'm going to throw a number of questions at Tino and Mitchell, and then around 5:45, we'll start the Q&A. You hopefully have some question cards in your hands. If not, you can sort of wave over. I believe it's Luke is going to be running up and down the aisles, collecting those cards. And at a certain point, we'll, transition to your questions for these esteemed guests. Let me give you a little bit of information about both of them. Mitchell is a Bay Area native, I guess I should say East Bay native, and has championed the open internet for 2 decades, currently holds several board positions. You probably know her because she co-founded and led the Mozilla Foundation and oversaw the development of the Firefox browser. Show of hands, who's used the Firefox browser? All right, cool. She earned her JD and her BA in Chinese Studies from UC Berkeley. Tino Cuellar, triple credentials here, law, poli-sci and international affairs. Tino became the 10th president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace a year ago. Congratulations.
4 years ago.
4 years ago. All right,
Great.
sorry, I'm reading
That's okay.
clearly
Gone by
wrong
really
information. Time flies here in Silicon Valley. He works with Governor Gavin Newsom on initiatives to advance safe and responsible AI. We'll get into that momentarily. A former justice of the California Supreme Court, served U.S. presidential administrations where he led teams on justice, public health, and immigration. Tino earned his BA from Harvard, his JD from Yale, and his PhD from Stanford. So the two Cal Bears will have to just deal with it. So I thought I might just start by asking you, Tino, you're not a technologist per se by trade. How did you get into this field? And what is it that you have done for Governor Newsom's administration?
Thank you, Rachel. It's great to be here, and thank you to our friends at SRI and PARC. Before I answer that question, I just have to tell you, I've been interested in technology, although you're right, I became a lawyer, a political scientist, but since I was a little kid, and I have been waiting for 25 years for somebody to invite me to PARC, and finally it's happened. There I was sitting by the phone, and it just would not ring. But an important step in that journey was when SRI and PARC effectively came together. So then my hopes came up a little bit because, SRI makes some thoughtful choices here and there. And so I'm very honored to be here. Anyway, long story short. So you're right. Most of the lanes I've occupied, I've spent 15 years teaching at Stanford Law School, running the International Studies Institute, and I worked at the Obama administration, the Clinton administration, and I was Supreme Court Justice. I now run the Carnegie Endowment. But if I can just take you back for a moment to when I was a college student, probably like many of you, I thought of college as, okay, someday I'll get a job, but also as one of the few moments in your life, if you're lucky enough to have that opportunity, where you can discover stuff. And I was fascinated by the question of what makes people do what they do, especially in politics or in law. I was so clueless back then in all kinds of ways you can explore, but I thought there was some mystery in you get a summons to jury service, why do you go? No one's looking over your shoulder. Probably you're not going to get super fined. You go vote. Why do you do that? Who do you choose to vote for? And in the tail end of my time in college, I kind of backed in by accident, this is the mid-90s, to neural networks as a way of representing the things that happen in the brain that made someone believe or see something in effect. So I put that on hold for many years as I went to law school and PhD and all that. But eventually in my government jobs at Treasury in the Clinton administration and then at the White House in the Obama administration, machine learning kept on coming up. And so when I came back to Stanford from working in Washington in the 2010s, I started trying to pull together a group of folks to start thinking about what are these technologies going to do to the way we understand the law and civil society and all that. So that's a short, too long, but you get the idea.
Medium version.
Medium version. Well, I actually, the first question was lead up to the second question, which is, given what we know about government at all levels, really, sclerotic, but definitely behind the times, always playing catch up, regardless of political party, is there any way in which government at any level can meaningfully regulate AI technology given the speed of development? To
me, the answer is a clear yes. And this lets me answer fully your question because you asked me a little bit about the work we did with the state of California. But the answer also is it has to be done carefully because let's think about how much the world has changed since we were kids, or at least I was a kid. In almost every way, the world is richer. There's more nutrition. There's more access to medicine. There's access to cleaner water. The air is cleaner in most places for most people. There are obviously exceptions. That process depends on a scientific and technical paradigm where we're discovering things, we're testing them out, we scale them in different ways, public sector, private sector. So I've seen that process benefit billions of people around the world. I mean, I've seen it happen around me. And I think that it is generally the case that as that occurs, there's some collaboration between some kind of private innovation, let's try this, let's sell it, and some degree of governmental engagement, sometimes as a core early partner with philanthropy, like with the Green Revolution, sometimes as a regulator to say, it's fine to have cars, it's fine to rely to some extent on fossil fuels, but can we not make these kids incredibly sick or elderly folks struggle to breathe? And we were just talking before we came out here about unleaded gasoline and about the emission standards in California that eventually changed the world. But so what the governor and the state asked a couple of us to do was to then take that point of view and ask, how can we take seriously all the potential upsides of frontier AI, but not ignore the potential risks, the ways in which people might be able to use the technology to develop cyber weapons, or the ways in which it might enable people who are trying to get around the law to do stuff. And what kind of knowledge do we need to create so we can better handle those risks while we enable the innovation? So that led to a report that was written at a fairly high level. It was not like subpart J should say this and with this comma, but it was much more like trust but verify. What does that mean? How can you make that work? How can you instantiate that in a requirement that the private sector working at the frontier release information about their safety protocols, protect whistleblowers, make sure that if there are incidents, those are reported? That was the idea.
Mitchell, my day job for KQED is covering how industry of all kinds, but most especially Silicon Valley, manages to subvert the processes of government and regulation, usually with money, but sometimes with political savvy. What can private industry offer us? Is there a way in which the example of open source code from previous technological revolutions can give us a sense of hope that there might be, I don't want to call it self-policing, but you know, that there can be technological tools that can help the forces of good, you know, keep this world safe for everybody else?
Well, the short answer, I'll say yes. And in a little more detail, I do think it's very important when we talk about trust, or what does trust mean with AI, that we talk in technical terms to go with the policy. Like, I'm a believer that it's very hard to make good policy distinct or separate from engagement in what's happening in the technology. And so that means that there needs to be a talent base of technologists who are interested enough in policy and policymakers with enough of a technical background. And also, one thing that's been very clear in a lot of regulation is that the remedies are very hard. And so we don't really know what to regulate towards. And lots of technical people will say, oh, the regulators are stupid. I mean, no, the regulators are not stupid. It's that the remedies are almost impossible. And so the way to regulate towards something comes from having technical advances and prototypes and proof of concepts. Pick whether it's interoperability or data portability, or now increasingly auditing and testing of various AI systems. And as the companies claim to understand more and more of what's happening, how do you trust but verify? Because if the solution doesn't involve technical engagement and process, it's going to be very weird. And so in the trust but verify, the analogy of open source is the most obvious and the most broad and comprehensive answer. And so I say what drives me today, I would say open must win in the AI space. And open is in quotes, or air quotes, because we don't know exactly what open means. It's not the open source definition of software, which I'm very familiar with. And I wrote an open source license, I don't know, a long time ago. So complied with it, was intimately familiar with it. And even when I read it now, I'm like, oh, that's really weird. Like, that's the Bruce Perens clause, and that's the Eric clause, and that's the Stallman clause. And, it's just so wrapped in the moment, it's hard to make sense. So it can't be the open source definition. It can't be porting the open source definition for software to an AI system. But the concepts that underlie why was open a movement? Why did it attract us? Why did people work for less? Why did we win? Why did we change the nature of computing from being communist, for being interested in open source, to where we are today, which is everywhere? And that involves actual practitioners, people building the technology. There are a lot of people who want technology to have better impact on society than we're seeing today. I mean, and they're spread all over, probably here too, but lots of people. And so what are the artifacts and what's the structure and how do we institutionalize the ability to do something different? And so developing the analogy of open source for AI systems is very high priority. And there's work underway, but it's not yet really deeply connected with the people thinking about the license and why do we have them with the practitioners. And then the final piece is those open source definition and licenses were really instantiations of a set of first principles or values. And in open source software, it was freedom. Like, that's the core of open source software. There were 4 freedoms. The 4 freedoms led to the open source definition, which led to licenses, which led to GitHub and GitLab. And so it's probably not freedom in the same way. But like there's a freedom, there's an educational piece, there's an opportunity for more, there's a learning, there's a trust but verify. And then, of course, on the enterprise side, there's a whole range of other motivations as well. And so I'll come back to the trust and verify. Open source is the best way to be able to do that.
Given where we're having this conversation tonight, given PARC's history, given SRI's present, do you think there are enough publicly focused, even nonprofit or hybrid organizations, labs that are doing the kind of work that will ensure that everybody gets access to cutting edge AI technology? Or do you think we need something additional?
Well, there's a little bit in your question I want to come back to, but the spirit of the question, no, we're very thin. And one of the things in the open internet era that made Mozilla unique was we were activists about open, but we were our activism showed up in the technology we built. Like, I didn't let Mozilla do policy for the first maybe decade, for a bunch of reasons. But eventually we got to a point where we built a policy team. But the core is the activism expressed through technological activities and products. And that's thin. And right now, with the resources and the race to maybe one organization can control everything, that's really thin. And I think our underlying understanding and appreciation and development of civil society as a whole and civil society institutions, I don't even know if that's a topic in school anymore. What is civics? Who are we? And so I think all those organizational structures need some development. And I think that our corporations code the structure of it is 120 years old, something, but it's been in a long century of extreme deregulation. And so you see the benefits of it and easy activities, but you see the downsides of it. And I think that in a time of disruption for how we regulate profit-driven enterprises, but also, I used to think it was coming sooner than it is, but I can see it right now.
Can I pick up on that just for a second?
Absolutely, yeah.
That's so interesting, and it fits together to my mind as a vision. I would add that if you go past the internet as a technology and think about the technology of knowledge when my organization, Carnegie, was created, which is 115 years ago, it was an imperative of our founder, Andrew Carnegie, to build libraries. Why did he want to? And he didn't want to build one big giant library. He wanted every community to have a library. And to this day, you can go to many, many parts of the US that have their Carnegie Library. You can go to 100 more communities abroad that have them. And the impulse behind that was powerful, and it was trying to make knowledge open and sort of remixable and sort of endlessly varied and catalytic, right? Now, I will note that one of the interesting things, if I go from that example to conversations scholars at Carnegie now have with different governments around the world, is they will say, we believe that AI can be and probably is headed to be a truly transformative technology. And we can talk about why. But then those very same governments will say, and we want sovereign AI. We want our own library, as it were, in our country. And if you then ask them, well, what do you mean by that? Do you want access to the API? Do you want your data centers? Do you want energy? Do you want to curate the model Is it the data you're talking about? I'll just be very blunt. I think the answers are not very crisp always. And I think that relates to the scare quotes around open a little bit, because the question of like, what is the critical thing that in order to make this technology democratized needs to be sort of openly available is a powerful question. And I will add, I also see the benefits of open, but I'll just note on the security and safety side, there are risks and questions about how can you make something open but also not truly dangerous, and there are trade-offs there potentially.
Very well put.
You want to pursue that, I know.
I want to say that
Yeah.
one of the things about open source was the conventional wisdom and advocacy on the part of some that it couldn't be secure. But I will say, having been in the browser sees so much and is such an odd thing, right? It executes untrusted code from any source you can find it at, right? And it's our job to protect you from that. I've seen a lot of what happens in closed companies with their security practices.
Yes.
Fair point,
And
right?
it's a lot to just believe that because all this stuff is closed and you don't know anything, it's more secure.
I think that's a very fair point. I guess I'll specify, following up on the spirit of let's get technical a little bit for a moment, right? I think one important distinction between a piece of code that is open source and the question of whether it can be secure and an AI model and whether it can be used in a safe way is that we're talking about slightly different things,
Yeah,
right?
I agree with that.
So I think I'm quite persuaded by the idea that the movement and the energy and what is now GitHub has proven that you can run a secure system based on open source code. I think the harsher trade-off is recognizing that if you have an open weight release and you retrain it, you can remove the guardrails, and there are things that the releasing entity can do to make that a little harder. But in my ideal world, there'd be like a bulletproof is not quite the word. There'd be a really strong moat around misuse of certain things. And some people disagree with that, but I think that's a technical as well as a policy challenge.
So it's definitely a technical challenge, yeah.
So Tina, as you know, the 2025 Carnegie California AI survey has come out. And I think it really gets to the trust aspect of the conversation we're having tonight. Most Californians across political affiliations, 79% of those polled, are very concerned or somewhat concerned that AI is baking in bias against all sorts of people in hiring, the granting of financial loans, rental applications, you name it. Similar percentages, so that is to say, most Californians across political affiliations want safety prioritized versus innovation. Like if it's a balance, they want safety prioritized. Most Californians of those polled fear government agencies at all levels using AI in ways that impact them personally. So my question is, how can the people in this room go out and advocate for an AI rollout that's more positively human-centric than what is happening right now?
That sounds to me like a very Mitchell Baker question.
Oh, I was going to say, that sounds to me like a policy question. I think it is unrealistic to expect technology companies to behave differently than other industries. Right?
Which
we have
is to say what?
We have less polluting manufacturing because we have policy and we know how to regulate it. We have safer cars because we know how to regulate it. So in your question, as I specifically remember it, what can people do? Like you're advocating as a consumer is kind of irrelevant given the scope, right? So I just don't understand why we think that industrial giants in one industry are going to care and behave and be incented differently than in every other industry. But which is not to say there are some great people in some of the giants here. I mean, I know there are a bunch of people working very hard to try and do the best thing and working on safety standards. I mean, like probably all of us here know them, like, and that goes up the leadership management chain in some, but institutionally, that's not in the institution of what these organizations are supposed to do. That's why I say I think corporate law is part of our problem. That's not the positive answer. So now you go. Say the other side.
At the risk of sounding too optimistic, no, but I think Mitchell highlights something very important, which is it's not hard to find actors at the frontier of any technology. And by the way, technologies we take for granted now, cars, were frontier technologies once upon a time, mobile phones, et cetera. And it's not, global banking, right? It's not hard to find large actors saying, we got this, it's okay. Like, I understand that there are concerns, but like, we'll take care of it. And I do think that your point, which is right, is that much of the history of human progress is innovation and dynamism and not overregulation, but also some accountability, some clarity of like, if you say you are protecting your workers, for example, in this industrial process in a certain way, well, it's nice to know that that's actually true sometimes. And gradually, however imperfectly, functioning countries get their way to that. Ideally, in our political process, there's a kind of alignment to push for that sort of balance. Now, we can talk about how democracy's gotten rougher and more difficult and more polarized. And in a way, part of my point is that everybody here should recognize that having technically very good AI policy, but still having a democracy that is very challenged, and there's a lot of noise, that's very difficult. So the two are interrelated. But I do want to say one thing that feels to me like it's also really important, which is, let us not forget the many ways society has failed to fully achieve its own goals in current models that don't use technology a little bit more. And in my previous role as a judge, I could tell you that it's really nice to go to another country and say, yeah, in the US we have the rule of law and we have a system where you can go to a court and there's a backstop and you can get your day in court. But by the way, okay, how do people get lawyers in America? Oh, well, that's kind of an awkward question. Well, some people don't have lawyers. Well, how many people don't have lawyers? Well, actually, most cases in California courts are people who are unrepresented low. But surely those are like low stakes, disputes like traffic and stuff like, and then you have to actually answer and say, well, some of them are and some of them are not. Some of them are about child custody. Some of them are about losing your home, right? And to the extent that we want to be, I think, honest about our commitment to the rule of law, I don't think anybody could persuade me right now that the right way to do that is to say, okay, lawyers are going to do a little bit more pro bono work, and then we'll do something to sort of make sure that people who are really poor have a little bit more money to pay for lawyers, and it'll just be fine. It's not fine. It's kind of a crisis. And I would say I see real pathways forward using fairly straightforward, basic generative models. I'd love for them to be sort of verified and red teamed and tested. They can guide people through a process that's very difficult. And yes, I would love for them to have as much as possible a human lawyer. But like part of my message in this space is do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
I kind of wonder, and I think a lot of people in this room may wonder it as well, whether the stakes are different because of the speed of development. And like you mentioned earlier, right? First we had cars and then we had seatbelts, right? And people had to die. There was chaos on the roads. And then, after many, many years, you could say society coalesced around the idea that you had to put guardrails around the technology. In this case, like AI is already shaking up all kinds of industries, all kinds of human behaviors. And I guess my question is, do you have faith, and this is really for both of you, do you have faith that there will be time for catch-up to sort of figure out the proper guardrails, not to stop the technology in its tracks, but to just put guardrails around it so that we don't kill ourselves in our enthusiasm for profit?
I think it kind of depends on how we act. To my mind, when I look at efforts like the California effort that are trying to make sure you don't like set forth a super detailed licensing requirement before we have the information to really understand whether that makes any sense, but at the same time move the needle and don't just leave everything to the status quo, that gives me some confidence that we can probably strike the right balance. When I see private sector actors that, however imperfectly, they do seem to be doing more than just paying lip service to safety, I think that's all positive. But I don't think we should be naive about the difficulty, because I'll just mention two facts that feel pretty important to me. The first one is Mitchell is completely right that technological ignorance leads to bad law and bad regulation. There's so many examples I can give you, but like if you're trying to regulate the amount of food additives in a particular piece of food and you peg the relevant standard to what the technology allows you to see, as the technology continues to change, smaller and smaller and smaller amounts of a particular compound that may, in a certain concentration, be dangerous are detectable. And you end up creating this giant sort of complicated compliance problem that didn't need to be there. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is that to get the balance right, we need to integrate technological knowledge and policy initiative and good law. And to my mind, just as it's true that the deployment of AI, the use of AI, the further development of AI is moving quickly, it's entirely possible to design legal mechanisms that survey and learn as they go, using some of the same technology. That raises the larger question of how we can make sure humans and human values stay in charge. But that's, to my mind, not an intractable problem. Co-author and I wrote an article called Artificially Intelligent Regulation to argue that, however imperfectly, if you have a concern about technology moving really quickly, that's really a signal to how effective and how smart government needs to be. And it's not the case that it's always going to be asymmetrical.
Any thoughts to add there, Mitchell?
That last piece about engaging, I guess I would +1 to that piece of technology is not going away. We don't know where it's going. I think there's going to be pretty significant changes that we can't imagine and therefore can't possibly build policy for. And so like actually engaging with the technology, that comes back to my earlier pieces about building, but even not building, actually engaging, and how is it useful in a positive sense. I think it's good, but I think we're going to be behind for quite a while. You know, like the question of copyright. Is the entire corpus that OpenAI started with legal or not? It's still open. Right. So, you know, who knows what the answer will be. But if you assume for a moment, I'm not saying I think this will happen, but if you assume that the answer was, oh, it's not legal, well, then what happens? Right. So we don't know about that. I think a lot of the laws about discrimination are open now. Like your point is true, like individuals are flawed in how they treat other people. And it's not like when you have only people in the loop, you know, we only see people and we don't see demographics. But when you have a system that's built on the past, you know, all these bias things, why is that? Why do we call it bias and not discrimination? I just don't understand how you as a government can like put a tool in place that has different results depending on, you know, the name or the race or whatever, you know, in there. I mean, that's what our laws are about for discrimination. So the law is so far behind, and the power of the technology to push us away from first principles is currently so strong. So I guess on the engagement piece, like, can we get back to first principles? Like this bias versus discrimination thing is boggling. Like if you have a municipal system that just, you know, has different results based on, you know, whatever your race is, or if you're, God forbid, have a woman's name in there, like, we know that's illegal, but somehow it's just bias. I just don't get it.
Can I just add one little piece to that? I think that's a...
Let me just call out, Kelly, you've got some questions because I know
Am I wrong?
time is limited, yeah.
But I think in what Mitchell said, there's another important point that is important to remember around conversations like, can you regulate the technology at all? It's pretty useful to remember that however imperfectly, we live in a common law system in the US. What does that mean practically? It means that anybody who says this should not be regulated is actually endorsing a different kind of regulation, which is the backdrop of the common law system, contract, tort law, which is judge-made, judge-curated, and judge-controlled, right? So this is, in a way, the equivalent of your technical point about getting into the details of technology, but on the law side, right? And so if you hear somebody say like, no, I think this is moving too fast, we can't regulate, you should ask them like, oh, do you love having judges in charge? Because that's really what you're asking for. And if you're not going to go in that direction, well, then what's the alternative to what the common law backstop is? And that leads to a different conversation.
So somebody has asked a question that I think reminds us that we all function in these sort of archaic and arbitrary borders, but technology supersedes borders, right? So how does all this work on a global stage? A UN sort of organization to organize it?
Well, I would say back in the early days of this AI chapter, when Sam Altman was testifying before Congress and people were scaling up ChatGPT use from like 1 million users to 1 billion users, there was talk about trying to learn from the analog of how we handle nuclear weapons and the risk of nuclear proliferation, and can we create an international atomic energy agency for AI that would just make sure the technology doesn't get out of whack or one country doesn't get a huge advantage. I don't hear that discussion much anymore, in part because I think folks have come to realize that while there are some risks associated with AI, it's very different technology. AI is a lot easier to scale and to proliferate, and also the nature of the industrial process you need to create it is very different. But I do think it's worth remembering that there are at least two or three imperatives that require some global conversation, to my mind. First one is about what the truly most dangerous geopolitical scenarios might be. Not fated to happen, not guaranteed to happen, but what would it look like if the US and China got into a particularly crazy and intense competitive dynamic around deployment of frontier AI into military applications? And is there some degree of common understanding, maybe the answer is no, but maybe yes, that might lead us to a balance that is short of just like, well, we're going to race ahead because we don't want you to be ahead. That's one. Second, going back to these countries from the global south that are asking, what about my AI? What about the AI that my country can control? Behind that, I think, is an authentic concern about what this technology looks like at scale and how it affects people's lives in the majority of the world, right? For them, their jobs, their health, their education, and the notion of trying to think through what are smart, thoughtful, beneficial deployments, how to gather data about that, how to share information about that across borders, that requires some coordination. And I would just say, watch the Indian AI Action Summit. I mean, it's not the Indian AI Summit, it's just the Global AI Summit, but it happens to be hosted by India in February of 2026. And I would not be surprised if a major area of focus is the creation of some cross-border network that can share these use cases and study them and provide access to compute and resources to really benefit people more directly.
Any thoughts, Mitchell?
So I think Tina's comments about very limited use cases are really interesting, particularly the maybe unintentional escalation of military things. I think the broader thing is pretty hard in the areas of content, as you pointed out earlier, right? Right. The content is like the word for social media, but it's the closest word where we don't have an agreement on what's right or what's truthful or what's not or what's the correct worldview. And so I think if you try to get outside these very narrow, very government or state actor type questions, it's very hard to make progress on that. Might be possible, though, I think, to have what are we'll say, security, verifiability, discriminatory process allowed or not allowed, or how much is allowed. You know, there might, I think it's possible to have once we have an understanding, some agreement, if not regulation, but some agreement that countries could say, yes, me too. Like, I don't want anything deployed in my country unless the following 15 things can be verified, externally, or unless X or Y or Z is open, or, like to hear these things. And then you have a more, well, maybe Europe will start like they did with the GDPR, but, you would have something where you said, this is what we expect of products, touching at least in our market. Now, then you have all the global pieces as well. But
It's possible the prospect of mutually assured destruction could lead people who don't agree on a lot of other things to at least come together about some certain basic principles.
That's one narrow context where the nuclear analogy actually is pretty provocatively interesting, because you can imagine how much the Soviet Union and the US rightly disagreed about. But the project of preventing proliferation was a project that was common. And now it's more complicated because, of course, there's a Chinese ratcheting up of their nuclear arsenal. But the idea that China and the US might disagree about all kinds of things and yet have some productive way of saying, let's not get into the most destructive dynamic with the technology, that despite our best efforts, we may not understand fully how it reacts to itself in a way over time. And by the way, let's remember, this audience knows that, but I'll just dwell on this point. The fantasy that the most advanced AI will come in the form of one singular system or two of them responding to each other rather than thousands, millions, sometimes billions potentially of agents that are interacting and potentially modifying themselves, that highlights the value of looking for that little sliver of agreement.
How can a do no harm freedom become a part of the fabric of AI development?
That's almost like a haiku. I'm just thinking in the springtime, right? I mean, can I take a stab at that? I think it is an interesting and thought-provoking question that I think I follow, but I'm not sure, but I think I do. And I would simply say, let me try an analogy that is not nuclear, but is fossil fuels, which is also an imperfect analogy. But the notion of how you go from do no harm to difficulty, to my mind, runs through what a conversation about fossil fuels might have been like in the 1950s. Imagine then there are some scientists that could have rightly pointed out that beginning as early as like 1910, 1920, we began to accumulate data on how this technology, fossil fuels, shaped potentially our atmosphere and likely would cause some real problems. But somebody from a country that had not yet experienced a boom in economic development could rightly say, that's easy for you to say, you scientists from a rich country. For my country, the only way I see forward for us to progress runs a little bit through the use of this technology, so don't ban it. So the response from the scientists might be, there might be 1 billion individual decisions in your country to use gasoline, oil, natural gas that you think are not harmful, but in the aggregate, they can be. So I would say getting the science and the policy right to allow us to see how much models and human behavior that might be totally safe when you have 1 or 2 or 10,000 people using them, it might be very different when you have 1 billion.
This is making my head hurt. I'm just like, I can't
I mean, it's fascinating, right? But you see the story of human development is so often like something that happens to be convenient to me at scale. If everybody does it in a certain way, it gets much more complicated.
So we started this conversation talking about trust, but somebody writes, you haven't defined trust. It has many forms.
Yes. Next question. No. What are your thoughts, Mitchell? Please.
okay, so there's maybe a philosophical discussion about what is trust and how do we engage with trust, and there's probably a kind of neuroscience discussion about human connection and why we believe in trust and so on. But again, I think I would focus on what makes something trustworthy. I always struggle with the word trust because they say, oh, like trust your managers. I'm like, but I know that person is a bad manager. So how can I trust the manager when the employee says X and I know the manager is bad at it? So this use of trust is very slippery. But here in this technology, this is why I talked about building and trust through technological means. It's like, what is trustworthy? And so you could make a long list of it. We'll have to settle for less than that. You would know where the data came from. You had verified a bunch of data. Maybe you can see the data, you can fix it. Like there's a set of things that you might say, well, the data is trustworthy. There's a set of things that you might say about how does the machine operate, or how much have we been able to verify, or do we understand that's trustworthy? What's the provenance of a piece of information, which increasingly we can do. There's advances in cryptography, which actually allow pretty amazing. Well, I guess to SRI, maybe I don't need to say that, but for many of us, like pretty amazing things that weren't very hard to deploy, a decade ago, are getting closer. And so you may have you ask a question, into an inference machine. What comes back out of that machine, and how much can you know and verify without being right in the middle of it? So you would have, I think, a set of categories that, and then you or the company or the maker of the product would decide, well, these categories are important. And again, I come back to open because in many of these things, I'll give you the question about proliferation of biochemical weapons that isn't true for open source software. Probably true in search, it's just easier, but how you verify these things to be trustworthy. Like the less you have to take on the human irrational belief that that brand was good to me in the past, so I trust it, has good security practices, and the more you can actually verify this stuff and be trustworthy. That's my starting point.
I love that answer. I'll just simply add that one place where this question of trust, we can give a technical definition. A social scientist might say, well, you act on certain information without either being coerced by force or having like a specific immediate payment for doing it. That's a kind of trust. But in this conversation, it feels to me like an important piece of the puzzle is to recognize that the models we're building now, which are not nearly as good as the models we'll have available in a year or in 5 years, can deceive their users about what the model is trying to do, what the model is going about doing to fulfill putatively the user's instruction. And that is, to my mind, a reminder about the following problem, which is human law is very imperfect. We can spend hours talking about it, but it's kind of built on a set of principles we've picked up as human beings for at least 1,000 years, maybe longer. And they're based on the idea that you cannot always trust humans, but when you can't, you build mechanisms, and we can call them the rule of law, we can call it regulation, we can call it incentive structures that suss out whether you can actually have faith in somebody. And it doesn't work perfectly, but it works okay in some countries. The technologies we're building are very useful. I've tried to make that case, but they're not trustworthy in the same sense. And I would just start from the premise that the tools that we have to try to tease apart when they can be delegated an important decision, like what to do with our kids for a couple of days, let's say. I don't know, I wouldn't trust them to do that. But the point is, some might legitimately say, well, I'm working 3 jobs. I need to make my kid happy, and I need to make some decision, and the model tells me I can trust it. So when do I know I can do it? The tools we have to make that decision with humans are not likely to play an equally useful role.
Well, any last thoughts, Mitchell, as you're listening to all of this?
I think a fair amount of change is coming. And I think we can't possibly imagine it. Just like a well-educated, well-traveled person in 1500 couldn't imagine 1780, let alone today. And so we can't possibly build regulatory systems and so on. But there are a few things. And one is, I think, to engage. But another is a question of I think democracy is going to be different. I don't think it's magically going to get fixed. If it was ever, whatever our golden age was, 50s, it's not for me.
It's
but,
in for some kind of overhaul. We just don't know what.
Something, yeah. But what are under the first principles of representative democracy, and why do we want it? And why is it so important to those of us who've grown up in it? Those principles, like figuring those out, because they are going to show up in some radically different way in the future. And so I think if it's possible, because it's hard when you're scared, but a little less trying to look to the past and a little more about, principles and like, it's going to be unimaginable to us, but what are the core things that we're trying to take forward, and keeping those front and center. Like humans, we're amazingly adaptable. And we make up stories for everything. And so our world today is unimaginable, completely unimaginable to someone 300 years ago. Unimaginable. You could pick up a phone. Anyway, and so let's say in 300 or 200 or 100 years, the life and society and daily activities of humanity is unimaginable to us. But the core principles of the dignity and value of a human being, or whatever it is about representational democracy that we think is progress, like we are good at being adaptable and bringing those things forward and finding new ways and new stories and new adaptations to take like the important things about us and our lives and project them into the future. And so that's where I'd focus.
Well, I'm afraid we have to leave it there. Please join me in thanking Mitchell and Tino for an amazing conversation.
And Rachel.
And Rachel, indeed.